What happens when a man with a badge, a gun, and a heart full of hate makes the single biggest mistake of his life? You're about to hear the story of Officer Frank Miller, a cop who saw a black man in a hoodie and decided he was a threat. He decided to teach him a lesson with his fists on a hot summer afternoon. But that lesson would boomerang back with the force of a hurricane. The man he punched wasn't a thug. He wasn't a dealer. He was the most powerful man in the entire city. This isn't just a story about a punch. It's about the shattering of a life, the exposure of a broken system, and the brutal, unrelenting nature of karma. Stay with us. The August sun beat down on Oakmont, North Carolina, with a suffocating intensity that made the asphalt soft and temper short. For Officer Frank Miller, the heat was just another antagonist in a city he felt was slipping through his fingers. He gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car, his knuckles white as he navigated the cracked streets of the Elmwood district. "Look at this place, Dave," he grunted, nodding towards a group of teenagers laughing on a street corner. "Used to be you'd see kids playing ball. Now it's just this." His partner, Officer David Ramirez, a younger cop who still had a sliver of optimism left, just shrugged. "They're just kids, Frank. It's summer." "Yeah, kids," Miller scoffed. The word dripped with disdain. To him, they weren't kids. They were future problems, statistics in waiting. Frank Miller was a man of simple, ugly certainties. He was a third-generation cop. His father and grandfather had worn the Oakmont PD blue. They had policed a different city, a city where lines were clear and respect was a one-way street, flowing obediently towards the badge. Frank clung to that legacy like a drowning man to a rotten plank. In his mind, the world had gone soft, coddling the very elements he'd sworn to contain. He saw the city's new mayor, Marcus Davenport, as the living embodiment of that softness. Elected on a wave of progressive enthusiasm 6 months prior, Davenport was everything Miller despised. He was young, Ivy League educated, and black. He talked about community policing, de-escalation, and systemic review. To Miller, these were just code words for being weak, for handcuffing the police and letting the animals run the zoo. He'd never met the man, only seen his smooth, smiling face on TV, and he hated him with a fervor that was almost personal. "We get a call?" Ramirez asked, breaking the silence. "Nah, just doing a little proactive policing," Miller said, his eyes scanning the block. The phrase was his go-to excuse for cruising through neighborhoods he deemed problematic, looking for a reason, any reason, to assert his authority. That's when he saw him. Ahead, next to a small, fledgling community garden plot wedged between two dilapidated buildings, a man was kneeling in the dirt. He was tall, well-built, and wearing gray sweatpants, a dark blue hoodie with the hood up against the sun, and scuffed work boots. He was methodically pulling weeds from around a row of tomato plants. Every single one of Frank Miller's prejudices flared to life. The neighborhood, the hoodie, the man's race. It was a perfect storm of stereotypes in his mind. "Bingo," Miller whispered, a predator's glint in his eye. He slowed the cruiser to a crawl. "What's our boy in the garden up to?" "Looks like he's gardening, Frank," Ramirez said, a note of weariness in his voice. He knew where this was going. In 100-degree heat, in that getup, he's either casing those apartments or he's stashed something in that dirt, Miller declared, his conclusion already set in stone. "Let's go have a chat." He pulled the car over abruptly, the tires crunching on loose gravel. He didn't wait for Ramirez, just swung his door open and strode toward the garden, his hand resting authoritatively on the butt of his Glock. The man in the garden, Marcus Davenport, heard the car and looked up. He shielded his eyes from the sun, his hands covered in rich, dark soil. He had intentionally come here alone, without his security detail, and dressed this way for a reason. This garden was his quiet project, a small, privately funded initiative he'd started to bring fresh produce to a food desert. He came on his off hours to work the soil himself, to feel connected to the community he served in a way press conferences and city hall meetings never could. It was his escape. "Afternoon," Davenport said, his voice calm and even. Miller ignored the greeting. He stopped a few feet away, planting his feet in a wide confrontational stance. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone accusatory. Davenport slowly rose to his feet, brushing the dirt from his hands onto his pants. "Just a little gardening, officer, trying to get these tomatoes to take." "I didn't ask for a botany lesson. I asked what you're doing here," Miller repeated, his voice louder now. Ramirez had caught up and stood a few paces behind, looking uneasy. "This is a community garden," Davenport explained, keeping his hands visible and away from his body. He'd been in this situation before, many times before he was mayor. He knew the dance. "I'm one of the volunteers." "Volunteer, huh?" Miller smirked. "Let me see some ID." Davenport's pleasant demeanor tightened just a fraction. "Am I being detained, officer? Have I done something wrong?" This was the moment. For Miller, this was the challenge, the refusal to immediately comply. In his world, it was a direct affront to his authority. It was the spark he was always looking for. "You're loitering in a high-crime area dressed like a damn thug. Now show me your ID before this gets unpleasant," Miller snarled, stepping closer, invading the man's personal space. "I believe I have the right to be in a public space, and I'm not required to identify myself unless you have reasonable suspicion that I've committed a crime. Pulling weeds isn't a crime, last I checked," Davenport stated, his voice still level, but now with a core of steel. He was testing the officer, wanting to see how far this would go. It was a dangerous game, but one he felt was necessary. The defiance, calm and articulate as it was, sent a jolt of pure rage through Frank Miller. This man wasn't scared. He wasn't intimidated. He was talking about his rights. It was the same kind of softness he saw in the new mayor, the same liberal nonsense he believed was ruining his city. "Oh, we got a constitutional scholar here, Dave," Miller shouted back at his partner, not taking his eyes off Davenport. He jabbed a thick finger into Davenport's chest. "You don't have any rights right now except the right to do what I tell you to do. Now I'm going to ask you one last time. Show me your ID." Davenport stood his ground. He looked from Miller's furious, reddening face to Ramirez's uncertain one. "Officer, I'd advise you to calm down." That was it. The final straw. The suggestion that he, Frank Miller, was the one out of control. It was an inversion of his entire worldview. In that instant, Marcus Davenport ceased to be a man. He was a symbol of everything Miller had lost, everything he hated. "You advise me?" Miller roared, his face contorted in a mask of fury, and then he swung. He didn't draw his baton. He didn't reach for his taser. He balled up his right hand and threw a powerful, vicious punch directly into Marcus Davenport's face. The crack of knuckles against cheekbone was sickeningly loud in the quiet afternoon air. Davenport stumbled backward, his head snapping to the side from the force of the blow. He tripped over a line of cinder blocks bordering the garden and fell hard onto his back, his head hitting the soft earth with a dull thud. For a moment, the world was a dizzying kaleidoscope of blue sky, green leaves, and exploding stars of pain behind his eyes. He tasted blood, coppery and hot, in his mouth. Miller stood over him, chest heaving, his fist still clenched. "See? That's what happens when you don't show respect," he panted, triumphant. Ramirez just stared, his mouth agape, his mind screaming. "Frank, what did you just do?" From across the street, a teenager who had been watching the entire exchange slowly lifted his cell phone, the red light of the record button already blinking. The world swam back into focus for Marcus Davenport in slow, painful waves. The first thing he registered was the throbbing in his jaw, a deep, electric ache that radiated up to his temple. The second was the taste of blood. He gingerly touched his lip. It was already swelling, split open against his teeth. He lay there for a second, the rough soil of the garden he'd been tending, now a cradle for his aching head. Above him, Officer Miller was a dark silhouette against the blinding sun, panting slightly, radiating an aura of smug satisfaction. "Had enough of your law lesson for today?" Miller taunted. "Or do we need to continue this down at the precinct?" Ramirez finally found his voice, a choked, panicked whisper. "Frank, Jesus Christ, Frank." Davenport ignored Miller's goading. He pushed himself up slowly, first onto his elbows, then into a sitting position. He spit a glob of blood and dirt onto the ground. His mind, which had been momentarily scrambled by the impact, was now working with a chilling, crystalline clarity. The initial shock was rapidly being replaced by a cold, controlled anger. Not just for the physical assault, but for the profound, arrogant injustice of it all. He had been punched for the crime of existing in a hoodie while black. He looked at Miller, truly looked at him. He saw the contempt in the officer's eyes, the complete lack of remorse, the certainty that he had done the right thing. And in that moment, Mayor Marcus Davenport made a decision. He would not scream. He would not curse. He would let the officer's own actions be the anvil on which his career was broken. With a grunt of pain, Davenport pushed himself to his feet. He was unsteady for a moment, but he squared his shoulders and faced the two officers. He met Miller's hateful glare with an unnerving calm. "You just made a mistake," Davenport said, his voice raspy. Miller laughed, a short, ugly bark. "The only mistake here is you, pal. Now for the last time, give me your damn ID before I add resisting arrest and assault on an officer to your tab." "Assault?" Davenport asked, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You're going to claim I assaulted you?" "My hand hurts from hitting your thick skull." "Looks like assault to me," Miller retorted, already building the false narrative in his head. Davenport simply shook his head slowly. He reached not into his front pocket, but into the deep inner pocket of the hoodie. For a tense second, Miller's hand went back to his gun. Ramirez flinched, but Davenport's hand emerged holding not a weapon, but a worn leather wallet. He didn't flip it open to his driver's license. He moved with a deliberate slowness, every gesture calculated. He opened it and carefully extracted a single, laminated card. He held it out. Miller snatched it from his hand impatiently. He glanced down, ready to run the name through the system and find a litany of priors to justify his actions. His eyes scanned the card. He saw the official seal of the city of Oakmont. He saw the photograph, a professionally taken headshot of the same man standing before him, albeit cleaned up, in a suit and tie. And he saw the name printed in bold official font. Marcus Davenport, Mayor, City of Oakmont. The world stopped. For Frank Miller, it was as if the ground had dissolved beneath his feet. The smug confidence drained from his face, replaced by a wave of sickening, ice-cold dread. The color vanished, leaving his skin a pasty, mottled gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His brain simply refused to process the information. It was impossible, a glitch in the matrix. He looked from the ID card to the man's bloody face, then back to the ID card. The confident politician in the photo and the man with the split lip were undeniably the same person. Ramirez, sensing the sudden, catastrophic shift in the atmosphere, stepped forward. "Frank, what is it?" Miller didn't answer. He couldn't. The ID slipped from his numb fingers and fluttered to the ground. Davenport bent down, picked it up, and calmly slid it back into his wallet. He looked at the utterly broken man in front of him. Miller's bravado had evaporated, replaced by the raw, primal fear of a man who has just walked off a cliff. "Officer Miller," Davenport said, reading the name tag on the officer's uniform for the first time. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an entire city government. "You have a right to remain silent." He then turned his gaze to the other officer. "Officer Ramirez, get your chief of police on the phone. Tell him to meet me at Oakmont General Hospital, and then," Davenport's eyes narrowed, "you will secure your partner's firearm and place him in the back of your vehicle. You will read him his rights. You are detaining him for assault and battery. Is that understood?" Ramirez stared, paralyzed. This was a nightmare, a direct order from the mayor of the city to arrest his own partner. He looked at Frank, who was now trembling, a fine sheen of sweat on his forehead, despite the heat. Frank looked like a ghost, his eyes wide with a terror Ramirez had never seen before. "Officer Ramirez!" Davenport's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through the younger cop's paralysis. "Is that understood?" Yes, sir. Mr. Mayor." "Sir," Ramirez stammered, fumbling for his radio, his hands shaking so badly he could barely key the microphone. Miller finally choked out a word, a pathetic, desperate plea. I didn't know." Mayor Davenport took a step closer, his face a mask of cold fury and profound disappointment. His jaw throbbed with every word. "That's the entire point, officer," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet each word a dagger. "You didn't know. You didn't care. You just saw a black man in a hoodie, and you decided he was less than human. Your problem isn't that you punched the mayor. It's that you punched a citizen. It's just your bad luck that today, the citizen you punched can burn your whole world to the ground." Across the street, the teenager lowered his phone, his eyes wide. He had it all. The confrontation, the punch, the stunning, world-altering revelation. He hit send. The video, raw and uncut, began its silent viral journey into the digital ether, an invisible tidal wave about to crash over the entire city. The sterile, antiseptic smell of Oakmont General Hospital was a stark contrast to the earthy scent of the garden. Mayor Marcus Davenport sat on the edge of an examination table, a doctor carefully stitching the gash on his lower lip. The local anesthetic did little to numb the deeper ache in his jaw or the simmering rage in his chest. His wife, Eleanor, stood beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her face a mixture of fury and fear. Across the room, looking profoundly uncomfortable in the clinical setting, was Police Chief Bill Brody. Brody was a veteran cop of the old school, a man who had navigated the city's political currents for 2 decades. He was stout, with a weathered face and weary eyes that had seen it all. But he'd never seen this. "Marcus, I am so sorry," Brody began, his voice a low rumble. "There's no excuse. None." Davenport didn't look at him, keeping his eyes fixed on the far wall. "Save the apologies, Bill. They're useless to me right now. What's the status of Officer Miller?" "He's at the downtown precinct in a holding cell. Ramirez is giving his statement to Internal Affairs as we speak. We've secured his body camera, Ramirez's, and the dash cam from the vehicle. I've placed Miller on unpaid administrative leave, effective immediately." "Unpaid leave?" Davenport finally turned to face the chief, his eyes blazing. "Bill, your officer committed a felony assault on camera for no reason. This isn't a matter for administrative leave. This is a criminal matter. I want him booked. I want the district attorney's office to have a file on their desk by morning. I was assaulted, and I want him charged." Eleanor squeezed his shoulder. "Marcus, maybe we should just—" "No, Ellie," he said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "This isn't about me anymore. What if I wasn't the mayor? What if I was just some guy from the neighborhood? What happens to him? Does he get a formal apology and a gift card? Or does he get a resisting arrest charge to go with his broken jaw? We all know the answer." Chief Brody nodded grimly. He knew the mayor was right. The system, his system, was designed to protect its own. An officer's word against the civilians, especially in a neighborhood like Elmwood, was an uneven fight. But this changed the entire calculus. "I understand, Mr. Mayor," Brody said, his tone formal. "I'll make the call to the DA myself. You'll have my full cooperation." As the doctor finished the last stitch, Davenport's chief of staff, a sharp woman named Maria Flores, rushed into the room, her face pale. She held up her phone. "It's everywhere, Marcus," she said breathlessly. "It's gone viral, a bystander's video. It's on every news site, every social media feed. CNN and Fox News are already picking it up. The Associated Press just sent out a bulletin." She showed him the screen. It was the teenager's video, shaky but brutally clear. It showed the whole ugly ballet. Miller's aggression, Davenport's calm refusal, the vicious punch, the fall. The audio was clear enough to hear the slurs, the demands, and the shock in Ramirez's voice. The video cut off just after the reveal, leaving millions of viewers with the stunning cliffhanger. Davenport watched it, a knot tightening in his stomach. His quiet, personal moment of service had become a public spectacle, a national flashpoint. "Schedule a press conference," he told Maria, his voice firm. "Tomorrow morning, on the steps of City Hall, and get me the file on Officer Frank Miller. I want his entire service record, every commendation and every complaint." Meanwhile, across town, Karen Miller was in her kitchen, unloading groceries, when her phone began to buzz incessantly. It was a group chat with other police wives. Confused, she opened it. "OMG, Karen, is this Frank? I just saw the news. Praying for you. Don't believe the media lies." A link was attached. Her heart pounding, she clicked it. The video played on her small screen. She saw her husband, her Frank, the man who played with their two young daughters in the backyard, his face twisted into a snarl she'd never seen before. She saw him throw the punch. She felt sick. The front door opened and closed. Frank walked in. He looked like a man who had aged 20 years in 3 hours. His uniform was rumpled, his face ashen. He looked at her, his eyes hollow and filled with a terrifying mix of anger and despair. "Don't," he said, his voice cracking. "Don't say a word. It's not what it looks like." "Not what it looks like," Karen whispered, holding up her phone. "Frank, you punched a man, for no reason. They're saying he's the mayor. He was antagonizing me. He was a mouthy thug in a hoodie, refusing to show ID," Frank yelled, his voice rising with panic and self-justification. "How was I supposed to know? It's a setup. That son of a bitch, he set me up. He wanted this to happen." The conspiracy theory tumbled from his lips, a desperate, flimsy shield against the crushing reality of what he had done. He was a victim. The mayor Davenport was an anti-police activist who had engineered the whole event to ruin him, to ruin the department. It had to be true. The alternative, that he was a violent, racist cop who had just destroyed his own life and his family's future, was too monstrous to contemplate. Karen stared at him, the man she had loved for 15 years. For the first time, she saw past the confident cop and the loving father. She saw something ugly and rotten coiled at his core, something he had always kept hidden. And she realized the man in the video wasn't an aberration. It was the real Frank. The press conference the next morning was a media circus. Dozens of cameras and reporters crowded the steps of City Hall. When Mayor Davenport emerged, a visible hush fell over the crowd. He walked to the podium, the morning light catching the fresh stitches and the dark, angry bruise blooming on his jaw. He looked directly into the cameras, his gaze unwavering. "Yesterday, I was the victim of an unprovoked assault at the hands of an officer of the Oakmont Police Department," he began, his voice clear and strong. "But I am not here today to talk about myself. I am lucky. I have a title, a platform, and a team of people to support me. My experience is not about the injustice done to a mayor. It is about the injustice that happens to countless others in our city who do not have a title, who are not filmed, and whose voices are not heard." He held up a folder. "I have here the service record of Officer Frank Miller. It contains several commendations for bravery. It also contains 4 prior excessive force complaints, all of which were dismissed with an internal reprimand. The victims in all 4 cases were minority citizens." A wave of murmurs went through the press corps. "This is not about one bad apple," Davenport continued, his voice rising with passion. "This is about a system that protects bad apples. It's about a culture that allows an officer to view a citizen as an enemy, to see a skin color and a hoodie and presume guilt. The punch I received is a symptom of a much deeper disease, and I promise you all, as your mayor, we are going to cure it. Effective immediately, I am requesting a full, independent investigation by the Department of Justice into the patterns and practices of the Oakmont Police Department. We will have transparency, we will have accountability, and we will have reform. This stops now." It was a declaration of war, not on the police, but on the culture of impunity that had protected men like Frank Miller for generations. From his living room, watching the press conference on TV, Frank Miller felt the last of his world crumble to dust. The mayor wasn't just coming for his job, he was coming for everything. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind. The Department of Justice agreed to open a preliminary investigation into the Oakmont PD. Protesters, energized by the mayor's stand, held peaceful but vocal rallies outside police headquarters. The story of the mayor and the cop was the lead item on national news broadcasts. Frank Miller became a household name, a face for police brutality. For Miller himself, life had become a claustrophobic nightmare. He was confined to his house, a pariah in his own neighborhood. News vans were parked on his street. His daughters were being taunted at school. His wife, Karen, moved like a ghost through their home, her silence a heavier condemnation than any shouted accusation. His only lifeline was the police union and its slick bulldog lawyer, a man named Bob Garrison. Garrison had a reputation for getting cops off the hook, no matter how damning the evidence. They met in Garrison's wood-paneled office, the air thick with the scent of old books and desperation. The video is bad, Frank. I'm not going to lie to you, Garrison said, leaning back in his leather chair. Public opinion is a tidal wave, and you're drowning. It was a setup, Miller repeated, the lie now his gospel. Davenport knew who I was. He provoked me. Nobody's going to buy that, Garrison said flatly, and a jury won't either. Right now, you're looking at termination, a civil lawsuit that will bankrupt you, and criminal charges that could mean prison time. We're not fighting to save your job anymore, Frank. We're fighting to keep you out of a cage. A cold sweat prickled Miller's skin. Prison. The word hung in the air, a terrifying possibility he'd never considered. Cops didn't go to prison. So what do we do? Miller asked, his voice weak. We can't fight the punch, Garrison explained, tapping a pen on his desk. So we have to fight the man. We need to change the narrative. Right now, he's St. Marcus, the victim martyr. We need to make him the villain. We need to find something in his past, something dirty, that we can use to discredit him. We need to make it look like he has a long-standing, violent grudge against the police. We need to paint him as the aggressor, the one with the agenda. Garrison hired a private investigator, a former detective named Sal Moretti, with a talent for digging through people's lives. For a week, Moretti scoured every corner of Marcus Davenport's past, from his childhood in Atlanta to his years at Harvard Law. He found nothing. Davenport's record was squeaky clean: scholarships, charity work, glowing recommendations. He was exactly the man he appeared to be. Just as they were about to give up, Moretti got a hit. It was small, but it was something. 20 years ago, when he was a 19-year-old college sophomore at UNC Chapel Hill, Marcus Davenport had been arrested. Garrison's eyes lit up when Moretti delivered the news. Arrested for what? Participating in a protest that turned into a riot, Moretti said, reading from his notes. It was after a controversial police shooting of an unarmed student. Davenport was one of about 30 people arrested. The charges were inciting a riot and resisting arrest. This is it, Garrison breathed, a slow smile spreading across his face. This is the golden ticket. Hold on, Moretti cautioned. The charges were dropped. All of them. Turns out another group of agitators started the violence, and the cops just rounded up everyone in the vicinity. There's even a note in the file from the DA at the time saying Davenport was likely trying to de-escalate the situation when he was arrested. Garrison waved a dismissive hand. Details, Sal, details. The public won't care that the charges were dropped. The headline is all that matters. Mayor Davenport arrested in anti-police riot? We leaked this. We paint him as a lifelong cop hater. We can argue this whole thing was a calculated act of revenge for his arrest 20 years ago. It creates reasonable doubt. It muddies the water. Their target for the leak was a conservative blogger and local radio host named Chet Riggs, a man who saw conspiracies everywhere and had a particular disdain for Mayor Davenport. Garrison fed him the story, complete with a copy of the old sealed arrest record. Riggs ran with it, gleefully. The story exploded. Mayor Davenport's secret radical past, arrested in violent anti-cop riot, the headline screamed. On his show, Riggs spun a tale of a young, radical Davenport filled with hate for the police, who had now used his power as mayor to entrap a good, honest cop. The narrative began to shift. The mayor's office was flooded with angry calls. The police union's message board lit up with support for Frank Miller. For the first time since the punch, Miller felt a flicker of hope. But they had made a colossal miscalculation. They had underestimated the city's real journalists. Sarah Jenkins was a reporter for the Oakmont Observer, the city's main newspaper. She was in her late 30s, sharp, relentless, and had a finely tuned nose for manufactured outrage. When the story about Davenport's college arrest broke, her first thought wasn't, wow, what a hypocrite, but why is this coming out now? She started digging. It didn't take her long to get the full story of the dropped charges and the DA's note. She saw the leak for what it was, a desperate, transparent smear campaign. But it made her curious. If the union was willing to go to these lengths to defend Miller, what else were they hiding? She decided to stop investigating the mayor and start investigating the cop. Using the 4 prior excessive force complaints Davenport had mentioned as a starting point, she filed a Freedom of Information Act request for the full unredacted case files. The city, under direct orders from the mayor's office to be fully transparent, complied immediately. The files were a revelation. In public, they were dismissed cases. Internally, the documents told a different story. One complaint from 3 years prior stood out. It was filed by a young Hispanic man named Javier Reyes, who was 18 at the time. Miller had stopped him for a broken taillight. The stop escalated. According to the report, Miller had pulled Reyes from the car, slammed him against the hood, and threatened to deport his entire family, even though Reyes was a U.S. citizen. Reyes filed a complaint but dropped it a week later, stating he no longer wished to pursue the matter. It smelled wrong to Sarah. Why would a terrified 18-year-old suddenly drop a complaint? She tracked down Javier Reyes. He was 21 now, working at his family's auto body shop. At first, he refused to talk, his eyes filled with a familiar fear. "It's over. I don't want any trouble," he said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Javier," Sarah said gently, "Officer Miller is in the news. He assaulted the mayor. What he did to you matters now. People will listen." Javier hesitated. He looked at his father, who was watching from across the shop. His father gave a slow, deliberate nod. The fear in Javier's eyes was slowly replaced by a resolve that had been buried for 3 years. "He said he knew where I lived," Javier said, his voice quiet but steady. "He followed me home a few days after I filed the complaint. He just parked across the street. For hours. He didn't have to say anything. I went down the next day and withdrew it. I was scared for my family." Sarah's blood ran cold. This wasn't just excessive force. This was witness intimidation, a felony. "There's more," Javier said, taking a deep breath. "My cousin was in the car with me. He recorded the whole stop on his phone. The threats, everything. We were too scared to ever show it to anyone." Sarah Jenkins' heart hammered in her chest. A second video. "Javier," she said, her voice taut with excitement. "Can I see that recording?" The smear campaign against Mayor Davenport was about to backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. The video from Javier Reyes' cousin's phone was raw and damning. The nighttime footage was grainy, illuminated only by the flashing red and blue lights of Miller's patrol car. But the audio was perfectly clear. It was a masterclass in abuse of power. "License and registration, now!" Miller's voice boomed, aggressive from the first second. "Yes, sir, officer. It's just in the glove." Javier's young, nervous voice replied, "Keep your hands where I can see them. Both of you." The video captured every moment of the escalating terror. It recorded Miller's tirade when Javier fumbled with the papers, the sound of the car door being ripped open, and the sickening thud as Miller slammed the teenager against the hood. But the most chilling part was the threat, delivered in a low, menacing snarl. "You know how easy it would be for me to find a little baggie of something in this car? Huh? A little present to send you away. Or maybe I just call my friends at ICE. You think they'd be interested in your TO's landscaping business? One phone call, kid. I could ruin your whole family. You remember that." The video ended there. It was 10 minutes of unadulterated, racially motivated intimidation. Sarah Jenkins knew she was holding a bomb. She worked through the night with her editor, verifying every detail, cross-referencing the video with the official complaint file, and preparing the story. The next morning, the front-page headline of the Oakmont Observer was stark and explosive. Second video emerges, Officer Miller intimidated past victim into silence. Oakmont PD accused of cover-up. The story was accompanied by the full, unedited video, which the newspaper posted on its website. If the first video of the mayor being punched was a shock wave, this was the Richter 10 earthquake that followed. The impact was immediate and catastrophic for Frank Miller and the police union. Their carefully constructed narrative of a good cop being set up by a radical mayor was instantly obliterated. The smear against Davenport was exposed as a desperate tactic to protect a serial abuser. Public opinion, which had been momentarily swayed, swung back against Miller with the force of a wrecking ball. In his office, union lawyer Bob Garrison watched the Javier Reyes video, his face ashen. He slammed his fist on his desk. "That idiot," he seethed. "That goddamn arrogant idiot." He had been played. Miller had assured him his record was clean, that the prior complaints were frivolous. Garrison's gamble to attack the mayor had not only failed, It had unearthed a far more damaging truth about his client. For Mayor Davenport, the new revelation was both horrifying and vindicating. It proved his point in the most visceral way possible. This wasn't about one punch. It was about a pattern. He called an emergency meeting with Chief Brody and the city attorney. "This changes everything, Bill," Davenport said, his voice cold as ice. "This isn't just assault anymore. This is a pattern of harassment, intimidation, and civil rights violations. Your department didn't just dismiss a complaint, they enabled a predator." Chief Brody looked like a broken man. The DOJ investigation, which had been preliminary, was now a full-blown crisis. Federal agents would be crawling all over his department for months, if not years. His legacy, his entire career, was in flames. I never saw the unofficial follow-up reports," he stammered. "The file was closed when the kid withdrew the complaint. It was buried by the previous administration." "That's the problem, Bill. The system is designed to bury these things," Davenport retorted. He turned to the city attorney. "I want Officer Miller's employment terminated, effective immediately. No more leave. No more union hearings. We invoke the moral turpitude clause. Fire him now." The legal machinery, greased by overwhelming political pressure and irrefutable video evidence, began to move with astonishing speed. Frank Miller received a certified letter that afternoon informing him that he was summarily discharged from the Oakmont Police Department. The badge that had been his identity, his birthright, was gone. The karma, however, was just getting started. The district attorney, who was already preparing assault charges, saw the second video and immediately upgraded the case. The DA's office announced new charges against Frank Miller: felony witness intimidation, official oppression, and multiple civil rights violations. The potential prison sentence had just multiplied, but the most immediate and painful blow came from within his own home. Karen Miller had watched the new video on the morning news. She saw her husband threaten to destroy a young man's family, his voice dripping with the same venom she now heard in his late-night, drunken rants about the mayor. That evening, when Frank came downstairs from his self-imposed exile in their bedroom, he found her in the living room with 2 suitcases packed. The girls were at her sister's house. "What's this?" he asked, his voice hollow. "I'm leaving, Frank," she said, not meeting his eyes. "I'm taking the girls and I'm going to my sister's. I've spoken to a lawyer." "Karen, no. You can't," he pleaded, the last foundation of his life crumbling. "They're lying. It's all a smear campaign." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were filled not with anger, but with a dead, empty pity. "Was Javier Reyes part of the smear campaign, Frank? Was that terrified boy a part of some grand conspiracy against you? Or were you just being a monster because you thought you could get away with it?" He had no answer. "The man I married, he put on a uniform to protect people," she said, her voice breaking. "That man, he's gone. I don't know who you are anymore, and I cannot let my daughters be around you. You are filled with so much hate. It's poison, Frank, and it's finally killed you." She picked up the suitcases and walked toward the door, not looking back. Frank Miller stood alone in the center of his living room, the silence of the empty house screaming in his ears. He had lost his badge, his freedom was in jeopardy, and now he had lost his family. He was utterly, completely alone, shipwrecked by the storm of his own making. The walls were closing in, and Frank Miller could feel their cold, concrete pressure in his bones. His termination was final. The district attorney was piling on charges. His wife was gone. The only calls he got were from reporters or angry citizens leaving vitriolic voicemails. The union, while still providing his legal defense, was distancing itself. He was radioactive. The linchpin in the DA's case, beyond the 2 damning videos, was Officer David Ramirez. As Miller's partner and the sole official witness, his testimony was crucial. Ramirez was caught in an impossible position. He'd spent his first few years on the force living by the blue wall of silence, the unspoken code that you never, ever rat on a fellow officer. Frank had been his training officer, a man he had, on some level, looked up to. But Ramirez couldn't shake the images from that day. The arrogance in Miller's eyes, the sound of the punch, the look of utter shock and betrayal on the mayor's face. And now the Javier Reyes video confirmed his deepest fears. This wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. This was who Frank Miller was. Internal affairs in the DA's office put Ramirez in a high-pressure squeeze. They had his body cam footage. It showed him standing by, doing nothing. They offered him a deal: testify truthfully against Miller, and he would face only a departmental suspension and mandatory retraining for failure to intervene. If he clammed up or lied, they would charge him as an accessory, and he'd lose his job and face jail time himself. Ramirez spent a sleepless week wrestling with his conscience. He thought about his own young son. What kind of man did he want his son to see him as? A liar who protected a bully, or a man who, when it mattered most, stood up and told the truth? He met with his own lawyer, a weary public defender, who laid out the stark reality. They have you, Dave. Your career is probably over either way, but only one path lets you sleep at night and keeps you out of an orange jumpsuit. With a heavy heart, Ramirez agreed to cooperate fully. He gave a sworn, videotaped deposition that was utterly devastating to Miller's case. He detailed not just the assault on the mayor, but countless other instances of Miller's casual racism and aggression. He recounted the times Frank would call in fake suspicious person reports just to harass people in minority neighborhoods. He described Miller's rants in the patrol car about Mayor Davenport, filled with racial slurs and contempt, which established a clear, pre-existing animus. Ramirez's confession was the final nail in Frank Miller's legal coffin. When Bob Garrison, Miller's lawyer, received a copy of the deposition, he knew the trial was unwinnable. Any shred of a defense they had, that it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, a moment of stress, was gone. Ramirez's testimony painted a clear picture of a malicious, premeditated pattern of abuse, culminating in the assault on the mayor. Garrison called Miller into his office for a final, brutal reality check. "It's over, Frank," Garrison said, tossing the deposition transcript on the table. "Your partner rolled over on you. He's corroborated everything. The DA is offering a plea deal." "I'm not taking a deal," Miller said stubbornly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Then you'll go to trial, and you will be convicted on all counts," Garrison countered, his voice sharp. "The jury will see the video of you punching the mayor. They'll see the video of you threatening that kid, Javier Reyes. And then they'll hear your own partner in full uniform get on the stand and tell them what a racist monster you are. You'll be sentenced to the maximum, 10 to 15 years in state prison, as a former cop. You know what that means. You won't last a week." The threat hung in the air, a vision of brutal prison justice. "What's the deal?" Miller asked, his voice barely a whisper. "You plead guilty to felony assault and 1 count of witness intimidation," Garrison laid out. "The other charges get dropped. The DA will recommend a sentence of 5 years, with possibility of parole after 3. It's a gift, Frank. It's the only move you have left." The fight had gone out of him. The rage, the self-pity, the denial, it all evaporated, leaving only the bitter, metallic taste of defeat. He saw the long, bleak corridor of years stretching out before him. 3 years, 5 years, an eternity. He thought of his daughters growing up, of Karen moving on, of his name becoming a permanent stain on his family's legacy. He nodded slowly. "Okay." The plea hearing was a quiet, somber affair. The courtroom was packed with journalists and members of the public. Mayor Davenport was there, sitting in the front row, his face impassive. Javier Reyes and his family were there too. Frank Miller, dressed in an ill-fitting suit, stood before the judge, a shadow of the swaggering, confident man he once was. He looked thin, pale, and broken. When the judge asked for his plea, his voice was a dry croak. "Guilty, Your Honor." He had to make a statement as part of the deal. He read from a prepared text, the words hollow and rehearsed, apologizing to Mayor Davenport and to the community. But then he looked up from the paper, his eyes finding Davenport's in the crowd. For a brief moment, the mask slipped. In his eyes, there was no remorse. There was only a flicker of the old impotent rage, a look that said, "You did this to me." Davenport met his gaze, and he didn't see a monster anymore. He saw a small, pathetic man, a bully who had finally been confronted with a power greater than his own prejudice. There was no satisfaction in it, only a profound sadness for the waste and the hate that had brought them all to this room. The judge accepted the plea. The sentencing was set for the following month. The legal battle was over, but the karma was not yet finished. Sentencing day was cold and gray, the sky over Oakmont the color of slate. Frank Miller stood before the judge one last time. The courtroom was silent as the judge delivered his final verdict. He took the plea deal into account but spoke with a cold fury about the abuse of public trust. "You did not just assault a man, Mr. Miller," the judge said, his voice echoing in the chamber. "You assaulted the very principles you swore an oath to protect. You used your badge not as a shield to protect the innocent, but as a weapon to intimidate the vulnerable. The damage you have done to the community's faith in law enforcement is incalculable." He sentenced Frank Miller to 5 years in state prison. The bailiff moved in, placing Miller in handcuffs. The click of the metal was the final punctuation mark on his old life. As he was led away, he glanced back at where his wife and daughters would have sat. The bench was empty. Miller's first few months in the North Carolina State Penitentiary were a living hell. As Garrison had predicted, being an ex-cop in prison made him a target. He was jumped in the yard during his first week, leaving him with 3 cracked ribs and a permanent limp. He was forced into isolation for his own protection, spending 23 hours a day in a tiny concrete cell. The authority and physical power he had wielded with such arrogance were gone. He was now the one who was powerless, the one who lived in constant fear. The bully had become the bullied, a cruel but fitting symmetry. Back in Oakmont, the fallout from Miller's actions continued to reshape the city. Mayor Davenport, armed with a powerful mandate for change and the full backing of the Department of Justice, began the hard work of police reform. The DOJ's final report was a scathing indictment of the Oakmont PD, identifying systemic issues with racial bias, excessive force, and a lack of accountability. Chief Brody was forced into early retirement, replaced by a reform-minded black woman from the Atlanta police force, who immediately began implementing sweeping changes. A new empowered civilian review board was created, with the power to independently investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. A duty to intervene policy was instituted, making it a fireable offense for an officer to witness misconduct and do nothing. A policy directly inspired by Ramirez's initial failure. David Ramirez himself served his 6-month suspension, completed extensive retraining, and returned to the force a changed man, often speaking to new recruits about the importance of integrity and the dangers of the blue wall. Mayor Davenport poured funding into community-based initiatives, including a massive expansion of the Community Garden Project in Elmwood. He knew that true safety didn't just come from policing, but from opportunity, investment, and trust. It wasn't a perfect transformation. The police union fought the reforms at every turn. There was still resentment and distrust on both sides. But for the first time in generations, real, tangible change was happening. The culture of impunity that protected Frank Miller had been shattered. 2 years into his sentence, Frank Miller was a ghost of his former self. He had lost weight, his hair was graying, and his eyes were perpetually downcast. Karen had divorced him. She had sold the house and moved with the girls to another state to start over, changing their last name. He received no letters, no visitors. His only connection to the outside world was a television in the common area. One evening, a local news report came on. It was a story about the 2nd anniversary of the Elmwood Community Garden. The camera panned over a thriving urban farm with local residents, black, white, and Hispanic, harvesting vegetables. The reporter was interviewing Mayor Davenport, who stood smiling, his sleeves rolled up, a small scar still faintly visible on his lip. "This garden is more than just a place for fresh food," Davenport was saying. "It's a symbol of what this community can build when we invest in each other, when we work the soil together." Watching from his plastic chair in the prison rec room, Frank Miller felt a hollow ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. He saw the city moving on without him, healing the wound he had inflicted. He saw the man he had tried to break, thriving and building something positive from the ugliness. It was in that moment that the final, crushing weight of his karma settled upon him. It wasn't just the prison, the divorce, or the loss of his job. It was the devastating realization of his own irrelevance. He had been a force of hate and destruction, but in the end, The community he despised, led by the man he assaulted, was building something that would outlast his legacy of bitterness. He was a footnote in a story about their resilience. He was forgotten. And that, for a man whose entire identity was built on power and demanding respect, was the ultimate punishment. He was nothing. The garden and the city would continue to grow without him. The story of Frank Miller and Mayor Marcus Davenport is a brutal lesson in karma, but it's more than that. It's a stark reminder that the systems we live in are only as strong as the people who are willing to hold them accountable. Mayor Davenport could have made it about personal revenge, but instead he used a moment of personal pain to force a necessary, painful conversation about justice and reform for his entire city. It shows that one person's actions, whether driven by hate or by hope, can have consequences that ripple out for years. If this story of justice and accountability resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to help us reach more people. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And most importantly, subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next story. Thank you for listening.